Tenemos a nuestras dos invitadas especiales del día de hoy, la doctora Laxmi Agarwal. Así, can I pronounce it? Is that correct?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Great. And Dr. Michelle Anagnostu. Ellos nos van a estar acompañando ellas dos. En un momento voy a presentarlas en español. Eh, y bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos por acompañarnos hoy, en especial a Michelle y a Laxmi, y gracias por estar a tiempo. Recordando que este es un seminario interinstitucional del Centro Regional de Investigaciones Multidisciplinarias de la Universidad Autónoma de San Luis Potosí, de ITESA Abasolo. Y antes de darle la bienvenida a Michelle, que sería la primer presentadora del día de hoy, vamos a recibir con mucho gusto otra vez a la doctora Nerea Marteache, que fue nuestra invitada especial del martes del módulo de comercio en la sesión uno y quien desafortunadamente no pudo terminar su presentación por falta de Wi-Fi y de la pérdida de electricidad que tuvo en la zona, en la universidad en donde se encuentra en California. Y Michelle ha estado de acuerdo en ceder unos minutos para que Medea pueda terminar su presentación sobre tráfico de serpientes. Nerea, te damos el micrófono para que puedas terminar tu conferencia. Muchísimas gracias por estar otra vez el día de hoy con nosotros.
Buenos días y muchísimas gracias de nuevo. Yo ahora ya, bienvenidos al tercer episodio de mi ponencia. Lo vamos a hacer modo telenovela para mantener el interés. Entonces,
La
vieron la
atención.
parte 1, vieron la parte 2 y ahora llega la tercera y final. Esperemos que la terminemos. Me voy a dirigir a la doctora Michelle un segundo. Michelle, I just wanted to really thank you for these 10 minutes at the beginning of your talk. So thank you so much. That also gave us an opportunity to connect via email. So thank you so much. Entonces, voy a compartir mi ponencia. Les voy a recordar, por si no se acuerdan de qué estamos hablando el martes, pero me voy a mantener así muy breve porque le estoy robando tiempo a una compañera. Mi ponencia era sobre el tráfico ilegal de serpientes como mascotas exóticas. La estructura era de guiones delictivos, es decir, habíamos hablado de la captura ilegal, cómo se capturan las serpientes, luego habíamos hablado de distintos modos de contrabando y transporte, y si no recuerdo mal, nos habíamos quedado en la comercialización en mercados y redes. Está hablando de las tiendas. Entonces me voy aquí y ahora sí ya comparto. Me dicen si estoy compartiendo. Sí, estoy compartiendo lo que toca. Vale.
Si quieres
Entonces,
darlo a modo presentación para que se vea más
lo
grande.
acabo de poner en modo presentación, pero no lo estoy compartiendo. Entonces, ¿qué tal si comparto lo que toca? Un segundo. Pues,
Sí, no te preocupes.
segundo, ahora comparto la pantalla completa. Vale, ahí, ¿sí?
Sí, gracias.
Bien. Entonces, simplemente recordarles que la importancia de los guiones delictivos es que cada uno de los pasos y dentro de cada paso, cada una de las escenas tiene unas propiedades específicas y un contexto específico, unos actores específicos, unos lugares específicos. Y entonces es muy importante hacer esta diferenciación porque la forma de prevención se tiene que estar dedicada, tiene que estar hecha específicamente para ese contexto, ¿no? Entonces, a nivel de comercialización en mercados y redes, para eh, el tráfico ilícito de serpientes vivas, tenemos la posibilidad de las tiendas de animales. Creo que esto lo habíamos visto ya, o sea que el tipo de, digamos, el consumidor o el cliente final de serpientes vivas suelen ser hombres jóvenes interesados en serpientes. Y entonces teníamos como tres contextos. Teníamos la tienda de animales, en el que tenemos, parecido a cuando teníamos granjas legales, un contexto legal, donde se venden legalmente, siguiendo regulaciones, toda una serie de animales, pero aquí cuando a través de estas tiendas se produce esta venta ilícita, pues tenemos el vendedor que tiene contactos con intermediarios a quien se le pueden pedir como cosas especiales, vengan directamente del pedidos por el cliente final, o bien porque es algo que quieran ofrecer ellos, ¿no? Entonces, claro, aquí la actividad ilegal es la obtención ilegal a través del intermediario y luego en función de si el consumidor es cómplice o no, o sea, si el consumidor es consciente de que está comprando algo ilegal, a lo mejor quiere tener una documentación falsa o a lo mejor le da igual. Entonces, la necesidad de la documentación falsa es o bien para estafar, bueno, no estafar, pero vender una serpiente a un consumidor que no sabe que es ilegal, o bien porque el consumidor lo pida porque lo quiere tener. Entonces, aquí medidas de prevención, claro, tenemos todas las autoridades regulatorias administrativas que investiguen o que controlen el tema del comercio legal, pero luego tenemos todo el tema también de falsificación de documental. Otra forma son las ferias de reptiles. Esta es la feria más grande que existe en Europa, se llama Terrarística y se produce en Hamm, en Alemania. Y entonces aquí tenemos distintos, dentro de la propia escena, claro, distintas incluso modalidades, ¿no? Porque la venta ilícita se puede producir por un vendedor profesional que tenga un puesto. Entonces ahí está la regulación de la feria. Aquí tenemos a esta persona controlada, sabemos quién es, solo que utiliza el puesto quizás para vender las serpientes ilícitas, junto con las lícitas, ¿no? También hay otros que no tienen puesto y entonces que se colocan por los alrededores de la feria porque sabiendo que es un encuentro anual de un montón de gente y de potenciales clientes e incluso otros intermediarios que compran varias serpientes para llevarlas a otros países, entonces que colocan sus puestecitos alrededor de lo que sería la feria. Entonces aquí ya tenemos dos niveles diferentes, ¿no? de control, porque dentro de la feria tenemos lo que se llama el place manager, o sea, la persona que está al cargo de la feria puede ejercer un control más directo. Luego ya tenemos todos los puestecitos que se colocan en Hamm durante esos días. Y luego ya vendedores particulares que simplemente utilizan la feria como punto de encuentro. Entonces aquí ya tenemos toda una serie de actividades ilegales que facilitan esto. Uso de documentación falsa, mal etiquetado de serpientes, ilícitas como lícitas, estos negocios paralelos, y todo esto se puede producir porque hay pagos que se dan en efectivo, utilizando PayPal, Bizum, que son menos, que se pueden seguir menos. Finalmente, tenemos, claro, la venta por Internet. Entonces ya la venta por Internet es ya mucho más difícil de controlar, pero funciona parecido, ¿no? a las tiendas físicas. O sea, estas tiendas que hay por Internet en general lo que suelen vender son serpientes lícitas, digamos, pero claro, hay este contacto privado donde se puede preguntar y entonces hay más anonimato, entonces tiene todas las ventajas que tiene lo que sería el uso del ciberespacio que ya les comenté el martes. Finalmente, el cuarto paso, que aquí ya no tiene escenas, es una vez ya el consumidor ha comprado la serpiente. Esto también estamos hablando de aquellos casos en los que la regulación nacional no permita el tener este tipo de serpiente a nivel particular, ¿no? Entonces, eso es delito si la tenencia está prohibida. Y es difícil, o sea, esto es una actividad difícil de monitorear porque, claro, uno lo tiene en su casa. Y además no son animales, no es como quien tiene un mono o un tigre, o sea, una serpiente no hace ruido y entonces se puede tener dentro de un terrario en casa y ahí está. Tiene, claro, hay peligros de mordedura en el caso de serpientes venenosas, de fuga, y entonces quizá la forma más fácil de monitoreo es que la gente que tiene serpientes suele ser una actividad como que están orgullosos de ella y a lo mejor hacen exhibición en redes sociales o en blogs. Entonces, quizá es más por ahí por donde se puede ir la detección de estos comportamientos o a través quizá de los proveedores de utensilios o de comida específicos para ciertos tipos de serpiente, pero ahí es complicado. Creo que ya estoy dentro de mis 10 minutos de discusión y conclusiones. Esto es muy en general, muy genérico. La idea es, de nuevo, que cada paso tiene su contexto específico, no tiene absolutamente nada que ver cómo vamos a prevenir la captura ilegal en medio del campo o cómo vamos a controlar la venta ilícita en la feria de Ham. Entonces, es importante y es muy útil el uso de los guiones delictivos para hacer este análisis detallado de quién hace qué, cuándo y dónde en cada uno de los pasos para diseñar estrategias de intervención específicas. O sea, a nivel general, la guía esta lo que tenía era la intención de formar a cuerpos policiales y personal relevante, ya sea desde guardabosques a personal de aduanas. Y en general hablamos, pues lo que les he ido contando, registro e inspección de granjas, tiendas, ferias, o sea, los lugares legales, el establecer sanciones, medidas punitivas, que se sepa que son así, aplicación de nuevas tecnologías, compartir información eh, entre agencias y luego la educación pública, no solo para que ayuden a detectar, o sea, por ejemplo, si sabemos que tenemos una granja ilegal o parece una granja ilegal, pues a lo mejor lo queremos denunciar, ¿no? Al lado de casa o cerca o sabemos de ello, pero también, y muy importante, para llegar a la reducción de la demanda de fauna exótica, que la gente sepa que no solo no se debe hacer, sino que es malo para el medio ambiente, es malo para nuestra comunidad cuando se empiezan a escapar estas serpientes, etcétera, etcétera. Y ya no les robo más tiempo, les recuerdo que ahora pondré el link en el chat, que el documento está disponible en inglés, pero que estoy ya muy cerca de tenerlo totalmente traducido y le pasaré el nuevo link a los organizadores para que lo distribuyan como vean conveniente cuando esté. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Nerea, por terminar la conferencia, que quedó incompleta el martes.
Pues
Eh,
conseguido.
Muchísimas gracias. Este es un trabajo que ya se publicó, es lo que entiendo, ¿verdad?
Pero está
Eh,
publicado solo en inglés.
si me pudieras compartir el link o en
Ahora
el chat
mismo. Ahora
del
mismo.
PDF que acabas de compartir, sería
Sí.
genial. Ya cuando esté en español lo hacemos llegar también a la...
En realidad va a estar en español en el mismo sitio.
Ah, ya.
Les mando el link más genérico también para... Y entonces yo lo que les puedo mandar es, una vez lo tenga, pues les mando el... Ahora les mando el link más genérico, porque además está muy bien para quien esté interesado. Hay también recursos en español
Sí.
eh, en esta... Bueno, si me permite lo enseño muy rápido, pero para que sepan lo que es. O sea, el link más genérico, no sé qué estoy ahora mismo, no he hecho lo que quiero hacer. Eh, Aquí, no sé
Si
si lo
alguien
ves.
quiere contactar a Nerea, ya se ve.
Sí,
Eh, Podemos compartir su correo, ya lo había puesto ya en pantalla.
pues aquí ahora lo pongo, pero ve que hay recursos que están traducidos ya al español, o sea, están en varios idiomas y esto, la verdad, son guías muy buenas para el análisis y la prevención de delitos contra la vida silvestre y entonces varios de estos documentos están traducidos y este que les he mandado yo está aquí, pero una vez lo tengamos traducido al español saldrá debajo y pondrá Spanish Translation.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias. Si nos pueden enviar las preguntas para Nerea por correo y yo se las hago llegar para ya no quitarle más tiempo a la doctora Michelle del tiempo que tiene para presentar. Ignacia había levantado la mano, no sé si es comentario o pregunta para Nerea.
No era pregunta, pero igual si gusta, doctora, mejor luego se la
Mejor
hago
luego
llegar.
lo vemos
Sí.
para recibir a Michelle. Y,
Thank you again.
y bueno, ya compartió Nerea en el chat en la liga a la página. Bueno, Nerea, muchísimas gracias. Estás invitadísima a quedarte en la sesión, obviamente. Si puedes, y seguimos en contacto. Y
Gracias.
bueno, las siguientes presentaciones son en inglés y estamos intentando resolver la cuestión, por si alguien no domina este idioma, que pudiera estar viendo los subtítulos de manera simultánea en lo que las ponentes exponen. Entonces me preguntan para activar, si ya pueden ver, digamos, en la sección de abajo, en sus monitores, pudieran activar. No sé si aparece en inglés, a mí me aparece en inglés captions. Si pudieran activarlo para quien necesite, al parecer ya está habilitado. Em, Vamos a hacer la prueba en lo que, en lo que presento a la doctora Michelle. Hi Michelle, nice to see you again. You're welcome. I will be talking to you in English, and I will be also talking in Spanish to everybody else at the same time. So I will now present you with the bio that you sent me. I will present you in Spanish, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Or I can read both, but most of the audience, I believe it's I should be talking in Spanish. So.
Okay.
Michelle Anagnostou es becaria postdoctoral de Banting en la Universidad de Oxford y investiga, trabaja en temas que tienen que ver con cómo aprovechar mejor las intervenciones contra el lavado de dinero para abordar el tema del comercio ilegal organizado de vida silvestre, que es el tema de este módulo. Michelle trabaja en colaboración con agencias policiales, bueno, ha trabajado y ha hecho mucho trabajo de campo con agencias policiales y de inteligencia. Ha realizado trabajo de campo sobre el comercio ilegal de vida silvestre en distintos lugares, como por ejemplo Uganda, Sudáfrica, Hong Kong y Canadá. También tiene experiencia de trabajo de campo en Costa Rica e Indonesia. Además de su beca de investigación, Michelle es consultora y líder de proyecto en la WWF sobre el desarrollo de soluciones de inteligencia artificial para examinar las reservas y la documentación de envío de productos de vida silvestre que han sido mal declarados o no declarados en las cadenas de suministro relacionadas con el mar. Michelle completó su doctorado en la Universidad de Waterloo, en Canadá. Su maestría fue en conservación y comercio internacional de vida silvestre en la Universidad de Kent, en el Reino Unido, y su licenciatura en ecología y biología evolutiva en la Universidad de Toronto, Canadá, y ambas con distinción y con honores. Entonces, bueno, pues le damos la más cordial bienvenida a Michelle y veo que ya compartió su presentación sin ningún problema. Y bueno, Michelle, thank you very much for being with us today, and the microphone is yours. We have around 130 participants already in the hall, so please go ahead. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Hi, everyone. Buenos dias. I'm so sorry that my Spanish is not at a level that I can present in, so please bear with me in English. Thank you so much for joining us today for this series. I've been really looking forward to it, and I think we have a lot of interesting things to discuss today, and I'm excited to share some of my research findings explaining illegal wildlife trade and crime convergence. My name is Michelle Anagnostou. I'm a Banting postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Oxford, and my current project focuses on understanding how we can better leverage anti-money laundering investigations to tackle illegal wildlife trade. So essentially that means I'm Canadian and I'm funded by the government of Canada, but right now I'm based in the UK at Oxford. And hopefully we'll have some time still to discuss questions after my presentation, but if not, please hang on to them, and my email is on my last slide, so you're welcome to reach out to me later. So I have this term in the title of my presentation, crime convergence. That essentially means the intersection of multiple crime types. Illegal wildlife trade is often publicly reported as converging with the same networks that are also trafficking in drugs, humans, and arms, and committing acts of terror. Often stated exactly like that in one sentence in high-level presentations and in the media. Now, the motivations for these claims of crime convergence have been questioned previously by scholars, given how little evidence is available. So some scholars have suggested that these links have been exaggerated so that organizations working in the environmental space can now tap into sources of funding and resources that are set aside for human security concerns and crimes that are more traditionally considered serious. Now, for a little bit of background, for those of you who are interested, probably all of the criminologists in the audience, I have published sort of the theoretical background to understand crime convergences. One of these papers is Synthesizing Knowledge on Crime Convergence and Illegal Wildlife Trade. And then another one follows, which is a systematic review of publications from the year 2000 to the year 2020. And then what I'll be presenting today, I haven't yet published, but it's sort of a continuation of this based on my PhD work. So as we all know, since this is a criminology program, organized crime is a dynamic and ever-evolving global threat, posing significant challenges to societies worldwide. Recent global assessments have identified a widening gap between criminality and state abilities to control or diminish organized crime, which means that, unfortunately, for all of us, we have a lot of work to do. I want to talk a little bit about silos. Governments typically address the variety of organized crime activities by designating separate departments, agencies, units. There might be distinct and specialized subunits within law enforcement for gang activity, cybercrime, narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, just to name a few. So relevant information on crime activities can also be held by health agencies, border, tax revenue, commercial agencies. Furthermore, law enforcement organizations typically separate staff by geographically defined jurisdictions, such as by province, state, county, municipality. The net result is that really, really important information on crime is scattered across many silos. So we all have different pieces of the puzzle. As a result of this, it can be very difficult to identify when complex organized crime groups are operating across jurisdictions and across multiple crime types. But with the rise of sophisticated transnational organized crime, it is increasingly important that we transcend these silos and piece together the fragmented information. So for understanding crime convergence, in some regions, there is quite robust evidence to suggest an overlap. For example, there's a pretty well-documented, strong and increasing presence of Mexican cartels in wildlife and fisheries industries in coastal areas of Mexico. However, in most other regions, there's quite limited or totally non-existent empirical and publicly available evidence on crime types converging with each other, with illegal wildlife trade, what species are involved, what does that relationship actually look like, and how these convergences are occurring in reality. Here you can see the gold or the brown part of the graph at the bottom are the academic peer-reviewed publications on the topic between the year 2000 and 2020. It has grown a little since then, but still largely insufficient, robust scholarly work for us to lean on this topic. My PhD aimed to disentangle these links and add some empirical evidence based on real cases, criminal intelligence, and investigations that I gathered through semi-structured interviews with law enforcement and other experts. So these are people who have led investigations, organized sting operations, looked through wildlife traffickers' phones and communications, interviewed arrested offenders, collected and analyzed intelligence, analyzed financial transactions, and put together cases on illegal wildlife trade. Now, there's numerous challenges associated with researching this topic. The concept of crime convergence is not something that's actually observable. It's an illegal activity, and it can't be soundly quantified. Data on converging crimes are not currently really being recorded in major wildlife trade databases. So my interviews aim to gather information from practitioners from various sectors. So that included law enforcement, national, provincial law enforcement agencies, drug enforcement, customs, NGO experts, anti-money launderers, including from banks and from government financial intelligence units, members of wildlife crime and law enforcement research institutions, academia, think tanks, legal professionals, including prosecutors, anti-poaching units, and intergovernmental organizations. I focused my research on South Africa, Hong Kong, and Canada, but because it's a global issue, I also talked to experts on crime convergence from a number of other countries. So these 3 studies were selected to compare findings on 3 different interconnected continents and at various stages of international supply chains. When I systematically reviewed the literature, I found that South Africa has the most public reporting on crime convergence by far, certainly in the English language. And it's generally a key source for illegal wildlife trade for international markets. So transit and destination states were selected for the other jurisdictions so that crime convergence patterns could be identified potentially based on different stages of the trafficking supply chains. So Hong Kong has been frequently identified as having weak systems for wildlife trade traceability, and it's widely recognized as one of the most important locations for illegal wildlife trade transshipments and re-export globally. Of course, in particular, part of that is due to its geographic location with mainland China. Now, Canada is a severely under-researched context for illegal wildlife trade. Although when you really think about it, its long, porous borders, proximity to the United States, long coastlines, abundance of really high-value wildlife, wealthy populations that can buy wildlife from other countries, and deep cultural and historic ties to natural resource exploitation actually make it a very likely location for illegal wildlife trade. Now, we're just going to dive right into the results. So the type of organized crime most frequently reported by interviewees to converge with illegal wildlife trade was perhaps unsurprisingly drug trafficking, reported by 61 people. In both Canada and South Africa, organized crime networks first became successful in drug trafficking before diversifying and transitioning into wildlife trafficking. As explained by one expert, in the case of the rhino horde trade in South Africa and Mozambique, in the early days, we saw a direct overlap with the drug trade. It was the networks who understood how to move drugs and were involved in corruption, and they had an apparatus. Individuals would then get involved in rhino poaching, and since then, it's escalated into its own thing. The drug to wildlife transition has been observed in Canada as well, for instance, with people commenting on a cross-border organized crime syndicate that was involved in trafficking in bear gallbladders, and the convergence there occurring at the marketing level, where individuals were collecting bear gallbladders from poachers and marketing them in the same way that they were simultaneously collecting and selling drugs. Interestingly, in other cases, the transition has been made in the opposite direction, where you have successful wildlife traffickers that have just been operating for about a decade, unabated, now thinking, hey, I'm going to get involved in drugs because I can, and it's going to make significantly more profits. In South Africa, generally speaking, the links between illegal wildlife trade and drugs are extensive, especially relating to two key species, abalone, which if you're not familiar, is a marine snail. So it's a mollusk that lives in the sea, and rhino. And rhino trafficking syndicates are also involved in cocaine, heroin, cannabis, and illegal alcohol trades, as well as the manufacturing of synthetic drugs. For abalone, an expert noted that they've had recent incidents with changes brought on by COVID. So where Asian buyers of abalone were themselves actively starting to sell drugs and methamphetamine in South Africa. And the reason why is that with COVID, people were more restricted on leaving the house and they weren't allowed to dive. And so there was a dip in the market. So to stay in their lifestyles, then they started selling narcotics. And the divers also insisted on more payment per kilogram. And they said that's impossible because we're going to have to ask more on the other side of the market in Asia for more money. And so there was this big argument in the network. But that just shows you how easily some of these well-established organized crime groups can shift opportunistically. And this pattern has also been observed in Hong Kong, where there's been reported connections with drugs, including cannabis, heroin, and cocaine, and pangolins from West Africa. One type of drug convergence that was noted in several provinces in Canada is bartering illegal drugs for legal wildlife products. Heroin and cocaine are used as payment, particularly in many remote communities of Canada. In one investigation, an interviewee stated that we were doing surveillance and they killed a sturgeon. Now, instead of just loading it into their truck, another vehicle came down the road and it was the local drug traffickers, and they were trading the sturgeon direct for heroin. Investigators in other provinces similarly explained that fish and other wildlife is used like cash for whatever that might be. It might be gas or booze or drug prescriptions. An officer in the Yukon, that's in the north, had said they've seen that too. I've seen a polar bear hide that came down to a drug dealer's house, and when the police raided his house, they found a grizzly bear hide and a polar bear hide, and this guy's never hunted. He's just getting this stuff from people that are trading it for drugs because it has significant value. And on the drugs there, again, it's narcotics, it's not lower level stuff. Now, in some cases, the drug wildlife trafficking link is a relatively small scale operation. However, in other cases, there is a really long-standing, large-scale, well-integrated convergence. So for example, on the west coast of Canada, individuals suspected of being involved in the illegal wildlife trade have deep connections to other crimes, including drug trafficking, fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion, and appear to be associates of known Asian organized crime groups. Turning to the East Coast as well, experts have said that they know organized crime has bought some of the fishing boats in the Maritimes, and that this is to facilitate the drug business, but also that it might just be a nice way to catch some fish. Actually do some illegal fishing and then put it on the market because it also pays. Another way that drug trafficking and wildlife trafficking can intersect with each other is what I refer to as product convergence. As one South African investigator noted that they received information that a triad had bought a South African farm for the purposes of trafficking in lion bones and lion products. So this so-called lion cake is made for traditional Asian medicine by chopping up a lion carcass and boiling it for up to 10 days, and you get the gelatin out of the joints, which then hardens as it dries, and it forms these big bulks, squares that you see here. Then interviewees who infiltrated and raided this farm found 365 kilos of lion cake at the property and 50 liters of opium. And they learned that the traffickers were actually mixing the heroin into the lion cake. So you can imagine that, of course, this product of, lion parts is going to make you feel better when there's narcotics mixed into it. And the leader of this operation was not there when the raid took place and took a flight out of the country that same day. Another way that wildlife trafficking and drug trafficking can intersect is with illegal drugs being used by individuals involved in illegal wildlife poaching or harvesting, sort of at the lowest level. So cannabis is the most commonly used drug by illegal wildlife harvesters in this study, including pangolin poachers, abalone divers, and rhino poachers. Cocaine and methamphetamine are also used. Interviewees mentioned that in rhino poaching, illegal drugs are often used actually to aid the poaching activity. For their ability to walk 30, 40 kilometers a day in the park in midsummer, they admit that they are on painkillers and weed, and that gives them power to go like a Boeing, in a quote. And it's called Niobe in South Africa, and it gives them energy to go on for hours and hours and hours into a park. Other interviewees stated that it was quite common for poachers to use marijuana, amphetamines, or uppers to keep themselves moving in the bush. And two interviewees thought that there might be a particularly strong nexus between reptile trafficking and cocaine use, which is quite interesting. Of course, that needs more research, but some of them theorized that maybe it's an adrenaline thing. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we can have organized crime, including successful drug trafficking networks that are actually consuming the wildlife. So multiple interviewees describe a link between drug trafficking and personal ownership of illegal wildlife for protection or as a status symbol. For example, a Canadian expert said that even to this day, organized crime without a doubt would be the ones when we get a call about a tiger or a lion or some exotic hot snake or Burmese python or something like that. Oftentimes it relates to organized crime. These individuals have dangerous animals for status and for protection. There might be a dangerous animal protecting their crop or door or their stash. And of course, there's nothing more fearful that you can instill in another organized crime member who's trying to steal your stuff than knowing you might be injured or attacked by a tiger or a lion. That still exists, and it probably always will. So this link was identified for crocodiles, caiman, jaguars, lions, tigers, leopards, lynx, and snakes. 36 interviewees identified a link between wildlife trafficking and human trafficking, and in particular, sex trafficking was reported in all three locations. This is reportedly at high levels of organized criminality. With regards to rhino trafficking, for example, an interviewee said that it's very wrapped up in the migrant trade. So that would be migrants coming from Mozambique into South Africa and other countries, and then they would go on to Europe from South Africa, or they would stay in South Africa. But these human trafficking networks are facilitating the rhino horn trade by using the same transportation. One of my investigations overlapped with a very specific investigation in Swaziland, where the traffickers were giving drugs to young women, getting them in compromised situations, and they were flying them out of the country or promising them jobs as models or something. These were usually young women with a little bit more means than your average villager, a little bit more sophistication, better education, so that came with a certain appeal. They'd be doped and taken to Europe, and it's all interrelated with rhino. The links between child sexual exploitation and illegal wildlife trade were reported in South Africa and Canada. In South Africa, an expert described an offender where his biggest business was doing cash loans at exorbitant interest rates, like 40%. People go to him out of desperation, borrow money, and then obviously after a month or two, they can't pay it back. Then he says, okay, bring me this, do this job. And that's people who don't want to get involved in crime, but they basically get forced into it. When they did a search and seizure in his house, they found over 300 bank cards that he had confiscated from people. And when you get a loan from him, he takes your bank card. Within a month, he takes out all your money and anything else, cleans it out. And then the other thing he did was child prostitution. Huge. It was a huge business. And again, it was people without any money And he'll say, oh no, it's okay. You've got a daughter, bring her for the weekend. And so there was this whole business that he was running to Johannesburg, mostly foreign nationals who would order children, come up for a weekend, prostitute them out, and bring them back. Disgusting. Another investigator described looking through a rhino poacher's phone and seeing child pornography, although this doesn't seem to be the norm in that case. But it has been reported a few times by interviewees. In Canada, an expert explained that they have major issues with illegal outfitting companies. Those are companies where a client pays to have help to ensure hunting success, essentially. And that there's a lot of illegal drugs that are typically associated with them. And when you bring up clients, apparently it's not uncommon for them to say, hey, do you want a boy or a girl? And when I say a boy or a girl, I mean a boy and a girl. Trade in human body parts and organs. This was reported in South Africa and Canada again. In South Africa, this mostly relates to traditional medicine. So one expert said that they've started investigations with body parts and then found rhino horn links. So body parts for traditional medicine, chop an arm off, chop genitals off, one gets involved in everything. And another interviewee said that they've seen murders on their phone, and a wildlife trafficker's phone, that is, and people harvesting blood illegally, again, for use in sort of black magic parts and processes. That it's the same people and it's driven by the same underworld. In Canada, the link between illegal wildlife trade and human body parts is a very different consumer, very different criminal profile. And these are people who are collectors of oddities. So an expert explained that there's an issue with human remains being dug out of places that they shouldn't be dug out of and then being sold on the black market. We see a lot of that kind of tied in with the oddities trade. So this could include reptiles, dead species of reptiles that are embalmed, bird feathers, bird parts, bird bones, and all of that kind of being commingled with the human bone trade and human organ trade. And depending on where the human remains are dug out of, that could be considered cultural objects. And the research also revealed that similar practices in locations outside of the three main jurisdictions occur. So in West Africa, for example, an investigator explained that they were going after ivory traffickers, and we got somebody also trafficking in human remains at the same time. Not just digging up the graves, they were either fresh corpses or having conversations about who do we want to be killed for that. So it's huge amounts of money, and this has been reported in Cameroon, Congo, and Uganda. Now, variations of coerced, forced, and bonded labor have been linked to illegal wildlife trade in all three jurisdictions. In South Africa, it's been described as not a huge percentage, but that when you go to the courts, you realize some of the people are being forced to do this. They've walked hundreds of kilometers, and maybe their family back in Mozambique has the threat of a firearm to their head. And there's quite some strong evidence to suggest that some of the smugglers of rhino horn are actually being forced to participate. And in Canada, one interviewee noted that they have seen indicators of forced labor linked to the illegal elk trade. And these are people who do not have their government documents on them. They're unable to articulate where they live. And when enforcement has gone onto the premise, there's people sleeping on the site, there's no windows, and that might tie into traditional medicine trade. So things like ginseng, sea cucumbers, and herb seal oil. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot to say about firearms and illegal wildlife trade. Unsurprising because A, you need weapons to poach wildlife, and B, where there's gang involvement, gangs need to defend their territories. That's the short version. I'll try and summarize it briefly, but in South Africa, arms trafficking and illegal firearm use is pretty much guaranteed for rhino trafficking, also very common among abalone traffickers. And interviewees mentioned that the police are sometimes complicit in these crimes, and that firearms that are confiscated by the police sometimes get leaked back into the hands of wildlife traffickers. Okay, we've got a rhino carcass, run ballistics on it. Oh, hang on, we've already seized that weapon. Oh, look, it's no longer in the safe. In Canada, an interviewee in one of the territories stated that quite often they're dealing with people that have been charged criminally for other offenses by the police. They've been prohibited for life or for a certain amount of time for possessing firearms, and they just disregard that completely because they want to keep going out and poaching. And that happens on a pretty regular basis for them. And similar to the South African rifle renting scenario, an official in a different Canadian province stated that a lot of First Nations communities where people are firearms prohibited or can't easily obtain them trade access to guns either on a temporary basis or permanently for the purposes of going out and killing wildlife. Counterfeit and pirated goods, I have examples of this in all three cases, but in Hong Kong, it was really, really clear and strong, this link. So that could be commingling of wildlife products in the same shipment with electronics, cigarettes, food and meat products, smartphones, computer parts, pharmaceuticals, luxury handbags, clothes, shoes, watches, alcohol, laptops, all have been identified in cases in speedboats that smuggle wildlife from Hong Kong to mainland China. And that would be turtles, succulents, fish maw, shark fin, and other seafood. So things that are kind of easy to put in a box and throw in a speedboat. And it's thought that a good justification for that is that traffickers are probably just trying to avoid the heavy tariffs on these products. Now, I researched this for 5 years, so there's a lot that I can't get to, but hopefully now a pretty clear image is forming that a range of organized crime activities, in fact, do relate to illegal wildlife trade. I've underlined the ones I couldn't get to, but that does include arms trafficking, sex trafficking, child abuse, migrant smuggling, illegal trade in human body parts, mined resources, so precious metals and minerals, counterfeit and pirated consumer goods, stolen vehicles, illegal alcohol trade, and drugs. And this can look like many different things as we've discussed. So it's important to consider sort of a more nuanced lens when we talk about crime convergences. So whether that's the barter trade, cashless transfer, hey, I'll give you this much narcotic for this much wildlife. Common fixers, maybe your professional money launderers, which we'll talk about in a second. Diversified networks, forced and bonded labor of people who are actually victims of human exploitation that are perpetrating the wildlife crimes, and a number of others that I've outlined in previous publications. Now, importantly, what I like to emphasize is that crime convergence does not necessarily mean that both or either crime is highly organized. Crime convergences can occur between different levels of criminal sophistication. So, for example, you could have a high level of sophistication in drugs, low level for wildlife. Maybe a really profitable drug trafficker who poaches wildlife on the side just for fun. Or a high level of sophistication for wildlife, low level drugs. Maybe an international, or maybe a poacher rather, who also recreationally uses drugs like cocaine or something for fun. Maybe a high level and high level would be your international money launderers, brokers, accountants for both drug and wildlife traffickers. And low level to low level would be, actually that would be more like a harvesters using illegal drugs, sort of that lower level of crime. And so that's a key finding here, is that we can't conflate crime convergence with highly organized crime. Sometimes it's just different levels of sophistication that we're seeing that bring these linkages about. So I also researched the use of money laundering tactics, including corruption, marketing, and violence, and I have data on these, but we don't have time to get to them all today. But I'm going to take a little bit of time and talk about money laundering, just because I think it's really particularly fascinating, and it might be sort of a new topic for a lot of the audience. So in all three jurisdictions, a lot of illegal wildlife trade is heavily cash-based, especially at the levels closest to the poaching event, as it's both less sophisticated and less traceable by financial institutions. Experts who have arranged sting operations in South Africa and Canada note that offenders almost always ask for cash and sometimes count it in a machine. And in South Africa, abalone experts have stated that they find garages full of money, floor to ceiling, with 100 Rand bills just stacked, stating that the amount of money in this trade is mind-boggling. Similarly, abalone traffickers in South Africa have been caught driving the abalone to Johannesburg for export, and then returning with over 10 million Rand hidden in their vehicles. Both South African and Canadian investigators mentioned that the real estate and automotive sectors are commonly used for money laundering. A lot of Canadians are aware of how, because this has been reported in the media, the housing market in British Columbia has been artificially inflated from offshore money being laundered through properties, and the folks there are starting to see a link between drug trafficking and these groups. And they've run deconfliction between wildlife trafficking and drug trafficking enforcement. And they're finding connections between the same players, whether it's a black bear paw or a kilo of cocaine. At an international level, however, cash is less practical. So that's where we see differences based on the level of sophistication and crime integration. So, for example, maybe wildlife traffickers who haven't faced a lot of scrutiny, like maybe some reptile traffickers, they're just going to use basic wire transfers, and sometimes even referencing wildlife in those transactions, which banks love, as well as e-wallets and global money transfer systems. But for larger scale operations, maybe like marine animal delicacies, import, export, and logistics companies play a huge, huge role. If funds need to be transferred across continents between wildlife traffickers, and maybe you don't necessarily know each other that well. Maybe I'm in Nigeria and you're in Vietnam. How are we going to do this? Well, let's trade. And they'll set up a trade in some other type of good and use that as a front for wildlife. And so it's just going to look like regular trade flow and the regular movement of money. Wildlife traffickers can also easily mask illegal wildlife products under the guise of legal wildlife businesses. We know that the legal trade in wildlife is hundreds of billions of dollars a year, so there's a lot of opportunities for laundering. So high-risk businesses based on these three jurisdictions were seafood companies, pet stores, wildlife-based pet supplies, the fashion industry, leathers, and there are exceptions to these. So sometimes they do use bulk cash across borders, but that's not exactly ideal for going through unnoticed. Now, though difficult to detect, some of these syndicates use informal banking systems, which are quite clever. So this one, for example, involves casinos, where a large rhino horn trafficking syndicate operating in South Africa owns a casino, and they own an import-export company. And so what they'll do is they'll send the rhino horn out, and in exchange, not money being sent back, but they'll send a shipping container full of material goods. And then those get distributed to all of the Chinese-owned shops in the neighboring province. Excuse me. And then those shops sell them, get cash back. A collector comes, gathers all of that cash, and brings it back to the casino. And that's the system. So it's really quite clever and really, really difficult to pick up on unless you have an informant to tell you these things. In Canada, wildlife traffickers may take advantage of business immigration visa programs to circumvent the limits on money transferred outside of mainland China. So they'll send an agent with large sums of their boss's money, claim to be a prospective entrepreneur as an easy pathway to immigrate, move dirty funds, and establish a presence in Canada. And these individuals have their own accountants pre-arranged. Now, if that money needs to be repatriated back to the East Asian country, they'll actually use wildlife to do that. So say you buy a polar bear mount or a hide or a narwhal tusk, you can buy that in Canada for, let's say, a couple $100. And then once you get that overseas to Asia, it's easily worth a lot more money. They also use middlemen and intermediaries. So rather than direct transactions, you'll move it to an intermediary, who moves it to an intermediary, who moves it to another person in a shop 20 kilometers away, who then gives it to a poacher. And so they do all of this layering to make it really confusing and really difficult for enforcement to pick up on. And professional money launderers are used by more sophisticated networks. Excuse me, sorry, it's really dry in here and it's making me cough. So these would be third-party people who provide their services to clean criminal proceeds in exchange for a commission. So they're not loyal to any particular network, but they'll clean the money of whoever's willing to pay them to do it. So they set up these apparatuses. They might set up a company, an import-export company, use it a couple times to make it look totally legitimate, sell that company to a wildlife trafficker. They'll use it a couple of times, and then they close it down. Sorry about that, everyone. Got my water bottle, so now I'm refreshed. Been talking all day and now starting to lose my voice, apparently.
Thank
So I'll try to wrap up really quickly because yeah, we are nearing my time, but some of the stuff I think is still really interesting for you guys to know if you're researching illegal wildlife trade is that while the majority of wildlife traffickers are not necessarily highly organized, the ones that are really quite clever. So for example, investigators in South Africa and Canada describe really, really long lengths of time that it takes to get wildlife traffickers to trust their undercover operatives. And that, in quotes, they're not stupid. If someone they know has been arrested, they actually analyze what happened that led to the arrest and then develop countermeasures to prevent it. And that they're really difficult to get access to. And in both Canada and South Africa, sometimes investigators start really understanding how a network is operating, how the syndicate is moving their money, how they're poaching wildlife. And then when they start to get close, poof, all of them just flee the country. They're back to their home country, maybe Southeast or East Asia, and probably having some sort of counterintelligence surveillance systems that they are using to help facilitate this. For example, especially in places like Johannesburg, there are people that just work on intelligence for the wildlife syndicates, and that's all they've done for years. So they know what properties to go to find rhino, where the rhino are on the properties. They know the anti-poacher's schedule and where they're going to be and when. And if you want to know any of this, all you have to do is just pay 25,000 Rand, and then they give you this information and off you go. Similarly, interviewees have described how law enforcement have began using a certain investigative approach, and wildlife traffickers just immediately figured it out and developed a workaround. And quoting, they've infiltrated every bit of information. The guys are going out tonight. The minute we get on our boat and start launching off, they know that. They have contacts at the harbor and the points of entry. Similarly, the use of counterintelligence was identified by interviewees in multiple locations in Canada, especially relating to illegal fisheries. And again, that's because there's a lot of money there and a lot of organization. In particular, Chinese syndicates operating in South Africa and Hong Kong tend to compartmentalize their operations to evade control. So when somebody gets arrested, they have no information to inform on the person above them, even if they wanted to. And that's intentional, and that's structured to shield the people operating at the highest level. And so in some cases, there have been people who work for these syndicates for 20 years, for example, as a defense attorney, and they don't know who they're working for. They get a call from an unknown number saying, go in there, defend those two people, and then money just goes into their account. Or people who are invited to go and defend a syndicate, and if they refuse, all of a sudden a Porsche is in their driveway of their office, and they're saying this is to go and defend those people. And so again, I think we really, really underestimate the sophistication of some wildlife trafficking networks. Now, it's increasingly recognized that arresting poachers does very little to stop these networks. They're easily replaced, sometimes even within 24 hours. Kind of like that carnival game whack-a-mole, you know, when you keep hitting them and they keep popping up. Anti-money laundering experts note that similarly, banks can close down, traffickers will simply go to another bank. Even when a so-called kingpin is removed, the network will reorganize itself. One expert said that there's a lot of fantasy in the wildlife enforcement community about bringing down kingpins, and we should have learned from 70 years of counter-narcotics efforts that taking out kingpins has very limited effectiveness. If a social media account is suspended, they'll create another one. If we close down an import-export company, they might open up another one and carry on elsewhere. So as much as I wish it was that easy, unfortunately, none of these approaches alone are going to dismantle an international wildlife trafficking operation with the ability to reorganize itself quickly. And therefore, we're going to need sustained pressure through dedicated, collaborative, and comprehensive organized crime investigations. So to sum up the challenges, we have some of this is not rocket science: insufficient support from governments worldwide, inadequate prioritization, under-resourced and understaffed wildlife enforcement, silos, as we've discussed, sufficient information sharing due to sometimes very valid legal barriers, bureaucracy, politics, sometimes ego, trust, fear. Limited support often from police and the non-wildlife focused law enforcement agencies that maybe don't have an understanding of wildlife trafficking, or they don't have capacity to support them, or they just don't see it as a serious crime, which is often the case. Limited financial crime literacy among wildlife law enforcers. And similarly, the anti-money launderers are still learning what to look for wildlife trafficking. So we're at a bit of a knowledge impasse there where we're going to need more information sharing and more collaborative efforts with those two sectors. And of course, a lack of addressing systemic drivers in marginalized communities, which I'm still failing to see a lot of really meaningful bottom-up supports for local communities that are high risk for wildlife trafficking. So I have a big list in my thesis of solutions. There's a lot to talk about. I've just highlighted a few here. Multi-agency task forces, collaboration, and implementing public awareness strategies to prevent wildlife trafficking. That was identified actually the highest number of times overall. However, this is actually not a major issue in South Africa, where they're worried that the public might actually be experiencing rhino fatigue. Instead, in South Africa, the priority next step is to ensure better integrity management and accountability for corruption, which is a must. That's going to be the foundation for everything. In Hong Kong, in addition to developing communication strategies for increased public awareness, interviewees thought that it was going to be really necessary to strengthen penalties to be proportional to the harm caused, that the penalties are acting as a real deterrent. And in Canada, the most popular solutions were increasing staffing, really, really big country for the amount of people who are working on this issue, allocating additional resources, including funding and access to investigative technologies, and prioritizing legal wildlife trade at the highest level of governance and asserting leadership on the issue, including internationally. However, these suggested solutions to engage Indigenous people and local communities in counter-trafficking interventions, counter-corruption, teach youth about integrity, ethics, valuing biodiversity at a young age, and generally raising awareness on the issue are all really key steps towards normative compliance. And of course, the foundation to most of the solutions I've identified emerge from prioritization and capacity building, expanding resources, and ongoing trainings. And as I mentioned, in particular, overcoming the siloed approach to law enforcement with joint task forces, intelligence hubs, working groups, and fusion centers. There's all of these different types of approaches for sharing information, and deciding which one to use just depends on the specific context and who's involved. So, key takeaways. Essentially, the results of this study, though it has been controversial in the past, really do strongly support the notion that illegal wildlife trade indeed converges with other organized crime types, although the duration of this, the extent of it, the nature of crime convergences differs based on a number of factors. It's also clear that this is not just an issue for kind of the usual suspects, the countries that are most named in wildlife trafficking hotspot lists, but also high-income countries of the global north, like Canada. Convergences between illegal wildlife trade and other types of organized crime activities can occur at any stage of the supply chain. At the lowest sourcing level, it could be relating to maybe poaching and illegal drug use, breaking and entering, illegally obtained firearms. At the international trafficking level, some organized crime syndicates have well-established routes and infrastructure that they can use for trafficking in drugs, arms, people, including distribution networks, money laundering apparatuses, and marketing tactics. Overall, transnational organized crime networks are becoming more interconnected, and networks involved in illegal wildlife trade are increasingly converging with other crime types through processes of globalization. Crime convergences are varied, they're complex, they're dynamic, insufficiently researched. If you would like research ideas, please come talk to me. And as our understanding of the complexity of crime convergence unfolds, the international community is going to have to increasingly appreciate the importance of finding ways to adopt more collaborative approaches. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for bearing with me while I hydrated. And there's my email, because I know we are short on time. So please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions about anything I've discussed today, and I'd be very happy to chat with you. Thanks so much.
Many thanks, Michelle. As always, very comprehensive, very extensive work that you're doing, very complex as well. So before we turn into Laxmi for the next conference, we will have some time for comments or questions from the audience or from Jose Luis or Ignacio. In the chat, the first question that we received, it's I'm not really sure about the specifics of the question. I don't know if you could help me figure out what are the dimensions of criminal networks trends. I don't know if you can answer as that, or we ask the person who put the question in the chat to turn off the camera and expand about that. I think it's quite general, but if you want to say something about it.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot that we're still picking up on. And from what I've talked to people who I swear probably have the strongest intelligence systems for wildlife trafficking. They've led a lot of investigations, and those people will still tell you there's so much we don't know. Some general trends we've picked up on, things like the shift to online space. Of course, it's introduces so many more uncertainties. Whose jurisdiction is it? How many species does that person have in stock? Where are they actually keeping the species or the product? It's just a really difficult space to enforce. So wildlife traffickers have picked up on that, and it is very common for them to use the surface web. And everyone who I've spoke to who has investigated the dark web says that there's actually not that much on there for wildlife because you don't need to. You can just use Facebook and e-commerce sites. So that's definitely a kind of a just general broad trend that we've picked up on. And sorry, I should give that person an opportunity to elaborate if they want to before I just keep rambling.
No, it's okay. Thank you very much. Well, people are congratulating you in the chat. That we're very thankful for your excellent presentation and very interesting. And so I have one question regarding you already mentioned. I know you have a lot of much more information, and it's impossible to present everything in one conference. But if you could share something else regarding the specific roles of women and children, apart from what you mentioned already. I know you mentioned different examples regarding exploitation. But for instance, women or children as facilitators or helping the networks, the illegal networks. I don't know if you got during your field research some information about this or not in any of the case studies, obviously.
I am so glad you asked this question. This is something that I am so passionate about because I find it so fascinating. And yes, I actually have a paper that I'm drafting right now on the gender dimensions of all of this, essentially. Across the board of the 3 case studies, generally speaking, it's quite rare to find women in the hunting roles, in the harvesting levels. That tends to be more male-dominated. That said, when it comes to the smuggling level, organized crime groups are aware of law enforcement biases. Law enforcement is generally a male-dominated profession. And so there's some kind of inherent biases towards women and girls, and they're not likely to be thought of as potentially being suspicious for smuggling activities. And so in some interviewees actually thought that they were overrepresented in cross-border smuggling. And especially if it's jewelry, for example, things like a big cat claw on a necklace, things that can fit in your jewelry or your makeup bags, things like that. Women are definitely actually highly, highly involved. And then at a more sophisticated level, in the money laundering and distribution of funds in the networks, that came up a lot. So I believe in all 3 case studies, there were examples of women who were in charge of laundering the money. And in some cases, a lot of people would just assume that it was the wife of the man who was actually running the show. But in some cases, there's examples where the wife and the husband were both involved, laundering their money through their own different systems. and that the wife actually had the more sophisticated, more advanced, difficult to detect money laundering system. So in some cases, I do think that organized crime groups are aware of biases in law enforcement. They're aware of some of the paternalistic chivalry that exists in the criminal justice system. That being said, it is really important to remember that women are often manipulated or coerced to be involved. Sometimes it would be the husband who is, or a boyfriend or a partner who is clearly the key wildlife trafficker. And when he suspects that law enforcement is onto him, he'll send his girlfriend to go to the transaction, and law enforcement arrests her, and she's, has very limited knowledge of wildlife or wildlife trafficking. So that does happen. And so essentially, it's actually quite complicated for moving forward with all of these different layers of complexity. And what I think we just need to do going forward is take a gender-sensitive approach. So just being aware as researchers or as law enforcement or anti-money launderers that there are these different complexities of gender-related exploitation, intriguing gender dynamics, and also being aware of our own biases. But yes, that is a really intriguing question, and I'd love to see more research on that space going forward.
Thank you very much. Jose Luis probably has some questions. I don't know if Laxmi would like to make one before. No? Okay. She's fine. Jose Luis.
Gracias, doctora. Van a ser dos muy rapiditas. Thank you, Michelle, for sharing this information and for your presentation. Congratulations. I'm gonna read the question because my English is bad. I think you have answered to all of the questions I was asking, but for clarification, to extent what have these studies serve to guide criminal investigations in Canada in particular, or have these studies been derived from criminal investigations? That's one. And the other, have you identified illegal wildlife trafficking as a subsistence activity or as a criminal associations, organized crime? And the third one and the last one, have you identified imminent risk to your personal safety or your team to do field work in scientific research in illegal wildlife trade? Thank you. Gracias. Sí, le preguntaba a la doctora precisamente si han identificado peligros o riesgos de la investigación en temas de tráfico ilegal de vida silvestre, en términos de tráfico por el crimen organizado. Y la otra es que si los estudios que han hecho se han derivado de investigaciones criminales o si los estudios han aportado información importante para la investigación criminal. Y la última, si lo han identificado como una actividad de subsistencia o solamente como actividades de crimen organizado. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much. Great questions. Maybe I'll go in reverse order. So on the safety thing, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And in some cases, the reality of fieldwork is that I think most of my concerns actually relate to just the typical being an academic, an early career researcher, being a woman in the field and working alone, which I did for my PhD. So those kind of have your just everyday concerns about being aware, especially in a place like South Africa. But when it does come to actually researching an organized crime type, I think one of the ways that I haven't been too worried is the fact that I'm working with law enforcement. So it's like a layer removed from the actual criminal networks themselves. In a sense, they actually have bigger fish to fry, which are the people I'm interviewing who are actually going out there and collecting evidence and taking people to court. That being said, every now and then I do learn things that don't come from law enforcement. For example, I have a very public profile, and it's happened where somebody has a bad relationship with law enforcement, but they're still unhappy with wildlife trafficking that's going on. And so they've actually reported to me to act as an intermediary, which is a very stressful position to be in. And that's happened more than once in more than one country. And then if given how much corruption is facilitating this crime, I have to think really, really carefully about who I'm going to talk to about that. So that's the only situation where I've been really concerned about my own well-being. But I think also there's some political aspects of it as well, if we're just being completely honest, like in a place like Hong Kong, where they have a national security law that criminalizes foreign collusion, criminalizes advocating for democracy. And so sometimes when I'm there, I just have to be a little bit more careful what I say, essentially, is how I look at it. But for the most part, I think working with law enforcement and gathering perceptions of people who are more directly working on the front line definitely helps for that. Your other question was about how I conceptualize wildlife trafficking as subsistence versus organized crime. So it's quite complicated, actually, because, of course, there's 200 plus definitions of organized crime out there. So who's to say if wildlife trafficking is a type of organized crime? I looked at the use of organized crime tactics by wildlife traffickers, and in which case we can conceptualize it that way because they do use corruption. They do use violence, actually quite strategically. So for example, the same network will only use violence in the areas where they know they can get away with it, just for a quick example of what I mean by that. And they do use money laundering. And so for example, if you're conceptualizing organized crime with these tactics, then wildlife trafficking fits that definition, and that's sort of more how I tend to conceptualize it in this study. But in other studies where I have looked at more local communities and human-wildlife conflicts and park rangers, then we might focus more on the subsistence elements. I'm so sorry. I think I forget the first question, but it was something about studying this in Canada. Do you mind repeating it, Jose?
Yeah, it was about if these studies serve to guide criminal investigations or the criminal investigations lead the scientific research.
Ooh, yes. I hope so. So I'm trying to always network with law enforcement in Canada. For this current project, I'm working with FinTrack, the Financial Intelligence Unit, the RCMP, that's our national police agency, Scotiabank, that's one of our biggest banks. And so I am trying to engage these different sectors so that they can take what I learn as an academic and make it useful for their work, which of course is my motivation for doing this, right? I'm very passionate about wildlife and I want my research to be applicable to practitioners. So I would like to say yes, that my research is going to contribute to investigations, contribute to prioritization of the issue. Hopefully, if I can sort of sound the alarm a little bit with, some publications. And for the research front, I would love to see more research on this in Canada. There's very, very few of us, although we are establishing a Canadian Wildlife Enforcement Research Network. I'm one of the founding members, and we're having our first in-person meeting in May. So that should be fun and hopefully get us together because we're so scattered. I'm here in the UK where it's totally different. You have these hubs of just experts at so many different universities that all they do is research wildlife trafficking together. Canada doesn't have that yet. But I would love to see that going forward, and I would love to be part of that. So hopefully we'll start to see things pick up, but it is a very new topic for Canadian academics. And yeah, fingers crossed that we start to get more students on board. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions?
Thank you, Jose Luis. Thank you, Michelle. We have, of course, more questions, but we don't want to take more of your time, and we don't want to take more time from Laxmi because she's next, and she's waiting already. But thank you very much, Michelle. It was so nice having you here in the seminar. Most people are from Latin America, mainly Mexico, but we have people as well from Spain and other countries, but mainly Latin America. So it was very, very interesting to listen to you today. And we hope we can continue working together somehow.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you everyone for your time, and thank you for listening.
And of course, you are welcome to stay if you want to listen to Laxmi. And also, we will be sending you the certificate of participation later on. So thank you very much. Thank you. Laxmi, nice having you here today. I will present you in Spanish, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Le damos la bienvenida a la doctora Laxmi Agarwal. Ella va a presentar un tema sobre el tráfico ilegal de especies maderables y plantas, especies maderables y no maderables. Y Laxmi, a lo largo de su carrera y de su trabajo, ha sido influenciada por su educación cerca. Mucho de su trabajo ha sido en el Parque Nacional del Serengeti. La doctora Laxmi completó su doctorado investigando los mercados ilegales de marfil en Tanzania, con la determinación de informar y de apoyar los diálogos políticos y adaptar enfoques de mitigación y de los descolonizadores a través de datos recopilados, de recopilación de evidencia a nivel local, con los matices culturales locales, con los contextos particulares de la región. Y como investigadora principal, Laxmi ha navegado por el acceso de información relacionado con los guardianes gubernamentales para conseguir, por ejemplo, trabajo con 67 entrevistas en profundidad, 21 de ellas con cazadores furtivos de elefantes que están en activo o que están incluso en prisión. A ella ha podido hablar con toda esta gente. Habiendo desarrollado una afinidad por la preservación del medio ambiente a una edad temprana, las experiencias académicas y laborales de Laxmi han estado comprometidas con la sostenibilidad. Laxmi tiene una licenciatura en ciencias ambientales centrada en temas que tienen que ver también con el cambio climático, captura de carbono en el suelo en el Ártico. Posteriormente, Laxmi obtuvo la maestría en Derecho Ambiental, enfocada en las complejidades de las evaluaciones de impacto ambiental, que hemos mencionado también aquí en el seminario, en toda el área de África Oriental. Las experiencias laborales de Laxmi incluyen principalmente conservación, comercio ilegal de vida silvestre, criminología verde, cuestiones también de ecoturismo, política, leyes, agricultura sostenible, cambio climático y proyectos de inversión. Su experiencia abarca diversos roles en el mundo académico y en los sectores público y privado, ejercidos en diversos lugares, incluidos el Reino Unido, Kenia, Tanzania, Nicaragua, China e India. Laxmi es actualmente responsable de políticas de conservación y trabaja en una asociación de la cual nos va a hablar para abordar en específico el comercio ilegal de plantas y maderas. Sin más, le damos la bienvenida a Laxmi. Laxmi, if you want to share a presentation, now you can, and we're very happy to be with you today.
Thank you so much for my introduction, and hello to everyone. I mean, we've had two great presentations, so I'll try my very best to follow on and keep everyone as engrossed as everyone else, my previous presenters did. So, as you know, my name is Lakshmi, and I am working with Botanical Gardens Conservation International. The layout of today's presentation, I will first tell you a little bit about BGCI, which often is not known unless you're part of like botanical gardens or plant conservation. I will then tell you about our work with the illegal plant trade and also with our work with the illegal timber trade. A little bit of more about why I'm presenting. I think Inez has completely covered that, so I won't go into that too much. But my previous research was based on a market reduction approach, which is a criminology strategy. And I believe one of the websites, the problem-oriented policing website, is shared with you, and this approach is actually on there. And I applied it to ivory poaching in Tanzania. I have since shifted my focus away from the illegal trade of animal and animal parts, and I'm currently focusing on the illegal trade of plants and trees, which of course comes with its own unique challenges and, you know, different sort of perceptions of plants as well. So we'll go into that in a little bit through this presentation. So first and foremost, BGCI is one of the largest plant conservation membership organizations. We are based on memberships, but we do have an accreditation scheme. So different gardens reach out to us and we sort of accredit them. But this means that we have a network of over 3,500 botanical gardens across the globe. We have access to over 60,000 technical experts. But what's even more is that through our garden visitors, we actually have access to 1 billion visitors through whom we can actually talk to, present awareness, and present some of our findings as well. So we are actually really, really well placed for certain work on illegal timber and plant trade. Due to our very global nature, we of course have to have a lot of regional offices. And of course, you may have come across the ones in your region. I have left them up here for you. But these then funnel up into the headquarters, which are based in Kew Botanical Gardens in London. In the year 2003, we were actively participating and managed to help in the conservation of 384 plant species. And this is often done through our consortia. And these are often groups that are plant groups that have been threatened. Of course, with plants, each species has to have its own experts, its own understanding, of every sort of which species falls into which criteria and so forth. So we do have these groups ongoing that feed into us with extra information. At the same time, with plants and trees, we also have the big issue of the exchange of pests, pathogens, and diseases. So we have our Plant Sentinel network that kind of manages this, ensures that there is communication between different teams, and they are aiming to establish early warning systems. So if a plant in, say, America is showing some signs, and they can communicate with the plant owners or the plant's native community in Australia and be like, we have experienced this pest issue here, and then they can go on from there. At the same time, we also go beyond gardens, as I think you're slowly understanding. We have an in-house team of a global tree assessment, and they are one of the first teams to actually go out and assess what trees we have and where are there and how many. So we're very new in understanding all this data, and it's, sort of just recently coming up, but our GTA team has been amazing. And they're close to assessing about 60,000 tree species now, which is all very new to the global database, to be honest. So at BGCI, we do have a lot of searchable databases. So for example, the Global Tree Portal also shows you conservation actions, which you can see where certain tree species are either having some conservation done for them in country or if they are not. But there is also a place where you can search about the plants. You can search which plants are threatened or are placed under CITES. There's a search for all our gardens in case you needed access to a specific garden in a specific region. Some of these databases are membership-based, but most of them are searchable. So I'm sure throughout all this seminar, you have all come across this very famous infographic, which always suggests that world trafficking is pretty high up there. It's behind the narcotics, it's behind the illegal arms, but as we know through Dr. Michelle, that it is all linked. But what is lesser known as well is that the illegal trade of wildlife is this trade that's happening. Why exactly are plants causing such an issue and who is actually going for them? There are many different demands for the plants. For example, orchids, it's beauty and rarity. With the succulents and cacti, it's very specific to plant enthusiasts and collectors. And with the cycads, one of the oldest type of plants we've known, they're very ornamental in their shape and they're very highly demanded. Of course, you have the issue of high value timber, where recently we've seen an increase in the demand for rosewood furniture, especially in Asia. And this immediately opens the gates for the illegal trade and illegal poaching of trees and plants. So what exactly are we planning to do at BGCI? As I've mentioned, we are very well placed in terms of our global outreach, and the data on plants and trees is very spread out, but each one has to be addressed separately. So at the moment, we're in the process of creating the Illegal Plant Trade Coalition, which will be launched at the IUCN World Congress later this year, I think October 2025. This is all still in the process of being made because everyone is just about coming together to address the illegal plant trade. But what exactly is the issue? What is the problem? The problem is that most consumers probably don't know that the plant sitting in their windowsill in their kitchen is actually rare and illegally taken from the wild. More plants actually go extinct per year in comparison to other fauna species. So since the 1800s, we've lost about 571 plant species in the wild. And, this has caused multiple levels of ecosystem disruption as well. And not to mention, because this trade is going on undercover or, in across all levels of trade, it's very hard to police the impact of invasive species, the sharing of pathogens, or the movement of diseases and pests as well. At the same time, when the plants are taken from the wild, a lot of cultures will stop using that plant, and then suddenly that knowledge about that plant or the benefits of the plant are completely lost to us. For example, and this example always shocks me, so I don't know if you have come across this, but in Vietnam, an orchid was discovered in 2010. And thanks to the internet and photo posting, everyone was recording it and putting it online. Within 6 months, 99% of the population of these orchids had been taken from the wild. And by 2015, there was only 10 plants left. And at the moment, it is fully extinct in the wild, and it is currently surviving only in certain botanical gardens. So at this stage, maybe you're thinking, well, at least it's surviving. The issue is that the plants that are in sort of conservation, you can say, or the ones that are in the gardens, don't actually have the same traits or the genetic diversity that the plants in the wild have. So although we are managing to conserve this plant, we are losing out so that the genetic diversity that would have been found in the wild. At the same time, South Africa is really having its own battles. I mean, they have the issue of rhino horn and abalone, but their deserts, sort of plants and succulents are being very much attacked. Since 2019, which is during when COVID lockdown took place, there was an increase in demand for house plants. There was this idea of being a plant mom or a plant dad, and everyone wanted this demand. And succulents and cacti are very easy to look after, and they're aesthetic and they're wanted in house. But since 2019, there have been 1.5 million illegally harvested succulents just from South Africa. And, this also goes to show in terms of the customs data we have, where in France, over 20,000 of the species were just from South Africa. And to be honest, certain other types of cacti that are now out there, have very, very few remaining populations in the wild. And South Africa is really coming together in terms of the organizations and national parks and pulling together to try and kind of prevent their wild populations going extinct. This issue is, of course, also very big in Mexico, and many of you will have probably heard of this because majority of the cacti in Mexico are also being poached on a daily basis. Most of the seizures between the US and Europe are at least 400 a year, plus or minus, of these targeted species. And they are just moving due to the demand by normal consumers who are completely unaware that their plants have been poached and taken illegally in a very unsustainable manner. But the thing is that no one is actually aware of the consequences of buying plants. It's something you do joyfully. It's something you go to the shops and want to purchase. But the biggest facilitator, as always, and one of the least monitored, the most difficult to monitor, is the internet. The traders and the buyers, they're all anonymous. The buyer doesn't know the trader doesn't know the buyer. They don't know where the plants have come from. The trader who's, got the illegal plants, he knows or she knows they're illegal, but they don't face any penalties because they can't be detected. And this is not even just the dark web. A lot of the plant sales are on the surface web. No one has just been able to point that some illegal activities are going on. There's very weak laws in terms of plants themselves. For example, with ivory online, someone would report it. With a cacti, people wouldn't know that that is something to report, for instance. And, plants, you can just put them in a box with some soil, put them in DHL, and send them across the borders. It's very, very difficult. So the Kew Botanical Garden in London has recently released a Flora Guard report, which actually has one of the first few amounts of data that we do have regarding this illegal trade. There are, of course, their own challenges when it comes to plants themselves. The first one being perception. Like I mentioned, you wouldn't think of plant extinction being a huge issue. There's not as many emotions as perhaps when you see the elephant populations going extinct. There's emotions, there's a family of elephants that has to be considered and the impact on them. In the case of plants, it's just seen as something that will go out and people won't even notice that they have gone extinct. And taking them from the wild is very similar to just going around. If you're a plant enthusiast, you may take a piece for a cutting to propagate at home, for example, or you may pick a flower because it looks beautiful.
Lakshmi, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that.
Now we can.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. So the perception of picking a flower, for instance, is not seen as something that could be detrimental to the environment. There are certain challenges that are faced by the enforcement in terms of resources and in human plant health and gardens themselves that are very much just for plants. So with gardens specifically, we actually interviewed, we reached out to 900, but we got replies back from 139 gardens who actually most of them didn't have any plan in place for tackling the illegal plant trade because most of them weren't even aware it was such a big issue.
We can't hear you.
I'm not sure what is happening, but
I'm not having any issues hearing her.
Yeah,
Maybe it's just me. Okay.
Yeah, I can hear her well too.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt. I thought it was.
No worries.
I won't do it again.
It's okay. So there is specific issues is that most of the gardens who are in conservation for plants are actually unaware that something needs to be done about the trade. One of the bigger issues, as always, whenever you're looking at green criminology and mitigating the illegal wildlife trade is capacity and funding. So the gardens themselves are struggling to find the capacity to train the staff to look after the plants that are being targeted. They're finding it challenging to find funding to even raise awareness about the illegal plant trade. Not to mention that gardens don't have the expertise. So, for example, with animal zoos and sort of even just the general trade in animals from one government to another, there's a general understanding how animals should be looked after, the issue of the illegal animal trade, and what certifications need to be in place. This level of expertise is still not very existent for plants, especially when you're looking at poached, threatened, and rare plants. So there is a lot of legality that needs to be worked on in terms of a global scale, a regional scale, and even at a very sort of garden-specific scale. So the main issue that we're facing in the illegal plant trade is the issue of confiscated plants. I have to remind you that some plant species will survive beyond 2 or 3 human generations. So how exactly do we house these confiscated plants? So for the last 3 years, there has been a report that over 720,000 plants have been seized. This is great. Sanbi alone in South Africa got 340,000 plants. This is also great. Maybe the trade is being blocked. But now what do we do with all these plants? How do we house them? Where do we find the money, the expertise to look after these plants? As mentioned before, each threatened group has its own experts because one person who is very fixed on a certain species, such as cacti, perhaps would not be able to work with succulents, for instance. So often there's a huge issue of who does this sort of responsibility fall on? And if it's the gardens, how can they actually find the money to kind of look after these plants? So this is an example of some of the confiscated plants, and you can see that the numbers are vast. There is an issue of storage space. There is an issue of even just general equipment. If you need a greenhouse, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, water, fertilizers, and so forth. So there is an issue on the agenda of funding. There's an issue on the agenda of workforce skills and training. And the other thing that the gardens would like to do, and which should be doable, is that if a plant is so rare, why can't we propagate it and then flood the market with a sustainable plant? And this is one of the challenges because propagation, as most of you may have plants in your home, you know, green fingers, propagation sometimes is not always successful. So we need training, we need the person, the people in the native country of the plants to say, this is the research we have. This is how you can look after your confiscated plants and propagate them to flood the market, for instance. So there's a lot of challenges that are quite new that we're still facing at the moment. And this is one of the challenges that the gardens have also highlighted is that they also need the policies in place in terms of how they can have some of these threatened species in their collection. How can they then move these species, propagate them, and then sell them? So what should be the policy on that, on the terms of illegal plant trade and, flooding the market? Does that maybe increase the poaching side again, or does it not? We're not sure in the context of plants, for instance. The other issue, unfortunately, and I know some animal and animal parts have this issue, like for instance, elephant ivory is sometimes very hard to detect compared to other bones, or very difficult to tell the difference between legal and illegal ivory from the 1989 ban. So similarly, with plants, it's even a bit harder because how do you get the customs officer to take a whole class on ecology of plants? How do you teach them that they need to know that succulents are a type, but there's like 100,000 other different types of succulents under there, and only these ones are illegal, and they need to tell the difference. So it becomes a very big issue in terms of how do we detect the plants going through and find the ones that are legal and illegal. And of course, the tracking details and shipping details on plants are impossible because even the name, the standardization of the plant's names is not fully clear. A succulent in one country could be called something else in another country, and there's no sort of standardization of this is the illegal plant because in the other country receiving it, they didn't know that that's the plant they were talking about. And this in the plant and timber trade is known as a synonym. So there's a lot of difficulties in that as well. There are certain efforts being made, of course. Thank goodness. There's traffic, and the Royal Botanical Gardens of Kew have looked into sort of new isotope technologies that are being trialed. I'm not sure at what scale as of yet, and we're all waiting on their report in terms of sort of just tracking the illegal plants. Hong Kong is at the moment looking to research a bit more on the illegal trade of their orchids. And of course, in Korea, there's also a very big focus on trafficked orchids because the demand for orchids is very high on the Asia side. And it's good to see that some of the farms and gardens are trying to take an approach to tackle it. So in a real sort of way, we really need to get the expertise from the horticulturists, the curators, and the conservation researchers to kind of come together, which is why we're going with this coalition, which is one of the first attempts to try and just get a platform so we can actually understand what is happening out there. It's very scattered, it's very big, and it's very unstandardized as the way it stands. We also need information to exchange in terms of propagation and just find a way that gardens can become more involved. In terms of law enforcement, as I mentioned, the biggest issue is identifying the species. But within that, there is also the issue of biosecurity and risk in terms of like the pests, diseases, invasive species that come with plant and timber trade. 55% of the gardens we interviewed did not actually engage with law enforcement and didn't find the need to do so because, as mentioned, the illegal plant trade is still very knocking on people's doors at the moment that something needs to be addressed. But where people have actually done it and got involved with enforcement, there have been great successes. Some examples are, of course, South Africa, who have really got one of the biggest challenges with their succulent trade. And then, of course, at the Kew Garden, where we are, we do work alongside the UK border force. And of course, the UK laws on plants coming in as well are quite tight. But Namibia itself are doing really well, and they've actually formed their own plant task team, which is really out there looking to research their illegal trade, because this is another region that has been heavily impacted, not just with sort of wildlife and animal parts poaching, but also with their plants species going extinct in the wild. As I mentioned, there is a huge problem with sort of access and benefit sharing in terms of plants. So plants are genetic, they have a lot of information. They stem beyond just general trade. For example, rice, it goes then, do you have a separate section for consumable plants and so forth? But there is a big issue in how do we share this information with one another? And if a plant is taken from one country, how can we make sure the source country benefits from the research being done on it? So all the laws surrounding plants exchange are quite at a very negotiable level at the moment. The Nagoya Protocol is coming together a bit more, which is a bit helpful as well. But there's still a lack of understanding in terms of what do we do with the illegal plants. This is all very much, this is a permit-based situation, but how do we control the non-permit plants that are coming in? It is very clear that the plant trade is global. It's as global as any other illegal trade, and probably does converge a lot with other illegal crimes and trades, just as mentioned in the previous presentation. So it does need a global response. So our partners at the moment are very heavily based across the map. At the moment, it's a very northern bias, but these are some of the founding members and funders of the Illegal Plant Trade Coalition. As I mentioned, we're going to still be launching at the IUCN World Congress in October, and we'll probably be taking more focused steps from there forward. At the moment, due to the amount of current resources available, we are focusing on live plants only. This means we won't be focusing on seeds, medicinal plants, or sort of dried plants that are in herbariums, for instance. Our main focus groups are the ones that keep coming up on the IUCN and the CITES lists, which is the cacti, the cycads, the orchids, and the succulents. At this very moment, as I mentioned, there's still a huge level of sort of behavioral change needed, understanding the perception. The illegal trade in wildlife and animal parts, for instance, has had a great boost of campaign, has had a great awareness structure, and a majority of the world is very clearly aware that there is a big issue regarding the illegal trade in animals and animal parts. At the moment, we're at the stage of making it even known that there is an illegal trade of plants that is very big, is very generating a lot of money, but is also causing a level of extinction in the wild that perhaps is not very sustainable in the long run, especially considering we don't actually know the number of total plant species out there. We don't know what benefits we may need from them in the future, especially if we're looking at it from a medicinal, sort of a health perspective as well. So we are at the process of providing multilingual guidelines, causing sort of more of an awareness campaign, a behavioral change campaign, but we're mainly looking to get some collaboration going, get everyone to talk to each other and realize what the issue is, because it is global and it needs a global response. It needs internal training where people can help enforcement with identification, where people can help the horticulturists with propagation. So there needs to be a platform where information can be exchanged at a very high level. So we're just trying to sort of ensure that that can take place. At the moment, one of the biggest sort of reports we have is the technical review that we produced. And this has some of the major case studies that we have been able to find and put together. And you will see from it that it's still very surface level. You know, we're still scratching, trying to understand a bit more and trying to get more data out there. But now that a few of the main doors have been knocked on, you can see a lot more organizations are getting ready and geared up to like start digging and find out what exactly is happening with the illegal plant trade. So this is one side of it that BGCI is focused on. Of course, with plants, they have their thing. And then with trees and timbers, they also have their own thing. As I mentioned recently, the Global Tree Assessment Team at BGCI is one of the first to understand what trees are out there and then assess them and find a way to standardize the different names. We are currently being supported by the Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund, which is UK-based, and they are really looking to develop a strategy to help counter the illegal trade in timber, threatened timber species, and also sort of help with sustainable livelihoods on the ground. A little bit of understanding about the illegal trade and sort of just the general idea of trees at risk. This is from the World's Tree Report, looking at a very global scale. And you can see that a vast majority of trees have not yet been evaluated or are data deficient. We don't know where they exist, how many they exist, or if we even have the total number of species. We do know that certain ones are threatened, but most of them are also facing extinction. And it is believed through this report that 142 species have already gone extinct. If we narrow down a little bit more from the global to the sort of more threatened species, the red list in 2022 said that almost 5,000 species were threatened and should be on the red list. Of those, 5 species have already gone extinct. And sorry, of those that they assessed, 34% were threatened. And you can see that there is a greater increase in concern and a greater increase to collect more data and see what is actually happening with the trees and the different species out there. But the issue is that the data is very limited. We don't know which country has what type of data they collect, and who collects it. But we do know that 800 species are now on CITES and are looking for non-detrimental findings. So the non-detrimental findings are an assessment that helps you address whether the species can be traded without the wild populations being impacted to extinction. But we don't even have the data to fill in these assessments. So using the funding we have received, we are trialing with 3 countries, which is Gabon, Ghana, and Madagascar. And at the moment, these are the focal species, and Madagascar is looking to add 2 more species into their research project, I should say. So the main aim of this is to find out what data already exists. Why should resources be wasted in us just doing a whole new study when we can actually just go to the countries and ask them, what data are you collecting? Because no one has done that, especially for the threatened timber species. So we are at the stage right now where we're rolling out a stakeholder survey to our in-country partners to cast a wide net and reach out to governments, communities, logging companies, plantations, anyone who has any dealings with any of the species mentioned, and just find out, either through observational data or hardcore data sets, what do we have out there. And then from there, we're hoping to then finalize sort of a protocol that can be used perhaps under CITES or the Red List assessments to then do a similar thing in other countries where there is a lack of data. So initially in this project, we did start off with a sort of a desk-based research to see what's already existing. And we found a lot of data gaps, which then led to our stakeholder survey. If our stakeholder survey comes back and says we actually don't have this data, this is when we gear up our resources further, and then we'll send the in-country teams to collect the data specifically, physically themselves. And this will then lead to additional training material for other in-country teams to use, just so we can fill these data gaps and actually make thorough decisions for tree conservation. So within all this, there is a very heavy green criminology lens in terms of this, that illegal trade in plants is coming to light now. And the illegal poaching of trees has always been an issue, but never fully addressed or collected on. So they are hidden environmental crimes with detrimental effects on the ecosystem as well as on biodiversity. And, you know, it's needing sort of more, it needs that whole green criminology idea of we need everyone to come together. We need to understand the criminology side and we need to understand the conservation side and put them together to find a way to mitigate the level of poaching that is taking place in the wild. So at the moment, we're just collecting the initial data so we can see what ideas that criminology already has existing can then be used to protect these species. Of course, the main issue, as always, with the illegal trade is the online platforms. And this is another area that really needs to be addressed through this as well. We are, of course, taking action, calling for a call to action with anyone that has any information on this so we can start pulling it all together and also just raising awareness on the issue and sort of, making consumers aware that they need to be more sustainable, they need to do a bit more research and make sure that they're making ethical purchases where possible. I mean, it's not like they are at fault either. There's just a lack of information on the plants you buy. So how much can you even give the responsibility to the purchaser at this stage? As mentioned, the illegal plant and timber trade has its own challenges. First and foremost is the perception of crime. It's always seen as something less serious. Picking a plant from the wild has always been something that is romanticized. You do when you're walking, for instance. There is a general lack of public awareness. Most of the people, when I was talking to them about my research on elephants and ivory, they all knew and they had a conversation with me. They were ready to talk. When I tell them about the plants, and they're like, oh, really? I didn't know. Succulents, but there's so many in the shops, and so forth. The other main issue with the illegal plants and timber is the lifespan and growth rates. As I mentioned, some of these plants and trees will survive beyond our generation. They'll go on to maybe 3 or 4 generations in some cases. So how exactly can we understand the environmental impact of these missing when we're not there to see it? So we do need to start recording it, and perhaps it's something that can go forward. But at the same time, also, when you want to bring back the species from the brink of extinction, it's a lot harder just due to the issues of successful propagation. And especially then, if you're taking a plant from a nursery, from a garden into the wild, the level of survival may not be as successful. As I mentioned, there's fewer legal understandings in terms of the illegal plants and trade. Even the generic legal trade of plants, there's not as much monitoring going on, although this is recently coming up more. There are multiple intermediaries, they're unknown to us who the buyers and sellers could be just because it's something that has never had to have a documentation attached to it. There's the issue of detection. I mean, each group of plants, each group of timber species needs its own group of experts. And how exactly do we take that sort of niche expertise and give it to border enforcement, for instance? How do you take that in-depth information for like 30 species that the border enforcement needs to have? And of course, the major issue is also if these species are gone, then, there is a loss of traditional knowledge, but at the same time, plants and trees are at the core of economic and cultural value, whether it's as food, whether it's as medicine, whether it's as wedding flowers, as tradition, culture. So it's quite a sensitive sort of topic even in terms of raising awareness. You don't want to tell people you can't do this, even though it's something, that's been part of their tradition for a long time. So at this very, very early stage, what exactly can you do as well? At the moment, we have our newsletters going. We have a few resources online on the BGCI page that you can access. If you are part of a garden or into horticulture, please do reach out to us. And if you have had any experience at all with illegal plants or timber poaching, please do share them with us, get in touch with us. We need to kind of bring this all together and kind of truly understand the scale of what we're dealing with, in essence. The Illegal Plant Trade Coalition has a page. As I mentioned, we are launching in October. You are free to join our page and our mailing list. And within the resources that come out at the IUCN, we will then be sharing them with our mailing list as well. If you want to get involved in the campaign, there's 3 different levels. You can simply join up, just understand what we are finding, we will share with you. And if you share that, then hopefully there can be an increase in awareness to the issues we're facing. Of course, you can also aim to be a Keystone partner. You can, within your individual level, you can share our technical review. You can simply just look at the plants you have at home, check if they're listed on CITES, just make sure you shop better, trade right, check where everything is coming from. But in all honesty, I think it's just at the stage, engage your networks and just get the word out there that illegal plant poaching is actually having quite a few impacts on the wild populations. I hope I haven't gone over. I haven't actually looked at my watch. I hope I didn't speak too fast as well. But yes, if you have any questions, please feel free to share with me.
Thank you very much, Laxmi. No, it was a great presentation and it wasn't fast or anything else. Thank you very much. I can see Michelle is here. I don't know if she has a question or something before I proceed to share others.
Sure, thank you. That was so interesting. Thank you, Lakshmi. It's so nice to see you face to face again. It's been a couple years. Amazing work. I was wondering if you could speak, I can put this in the chat actually, if it helps for the Spanish speakers. I was wondering if you could speak a little about repatriation to other countries from the country of seizure. So with animals, there's concerns about animal welfare and their stress levels and zoonotic diseases and quarantines. Is it any easier maybe to get confiscated plants back to their home countries? Is there any silver lining to all of this?
And unfortunately, no. Plants also go through a similar stress level. So a lot of movement, you'll see even just moving one plant from facing this way to the sun to the other, they do have their own stress levels. But at the same time, like you've mentioned, the sort of pests and diseases issues very much goes across to plants because the country receiving back the plants don't know what it has been exposed to in the foreign countries, for example. So they're very worried about receiving them. And with plants, there is a law in place. If you are receiving a plant, they do have to be quarantined for a certain amount of time to ensure how they're being, what comes through from them, for instance, and they have to be monitored. And then only then would they be released to a collection in a botanical garden, for instance. So there is unfortunately no silver lining. Moving a plant back is very expensive. It's very time consuming. It perhaps could be unsuccessful given the stress that a plant has gone under. And at the same time, most places who are dealing with confiscated plants would rather just burn them rather than try and help them survive. I hope that answers.
It does, thank you. And if I could
No
ask
worries.
one more and then we can open up the floor.
Yes, I
Are,
have to go.
oh, sorry, is Ines speaking?
No. I mean, go ahead. If you have to go, please go ahead with your questions and then we can continue with the session. Thank you.
Thanks. I was going to say, are some illegally traded plants thought to be more desirable when they're captive bred versus propagated? And again, just thinking about comparisons to animals, where some animals are more desirable for consumers because they're wild and the thought that in traditional medicine, maybe they're more potent or maybe the meat tastes better than when they're captive bred. Does that issue also come up in your work?
Very heavily, especially in terms of the potency if being used in traditional medicine. The great example is ginseng. The wild one is always thought to be more potent and have the stronger effect rather than a cultivated one, which is why there's such a high level of illegal trade in ginseng as well. Most consumers won't buy the ones that are grown sustainably because they feel like it doesn't have that impact. At the same time, certain plants actually develop very different characteristics when they're in the wild. That could even be different colors. That could be certain markings on the plant because certain insects have been feeding on them, for instance, and that it completely changes the outlook of the plant, and it will always be favored more in the wild rather than one that's been looked after in a beautiful garden. So sometimes people don't want the propagation. I mean, the flooding of the market with propagated plants is very much limited to the ones to a specific few species, if that makes sense. There is a need for wild illegal plants as well, unfortunately.
A lot of people are thanking in the chat, Laxmi, and
Thank you.
congratulations to you from many of the attendees.
Thank
I don't know if Jose Luis or Ignacio have a question. There is a question from the chat. If you could speak a bit more about this novel isotopes technology by Traffic and by Kew Gardens in the UK.
Yeah, so this is a very much at a trial period, and I think they're believing to use some of the isotopic understanding of plants almost as a way of tracking where certain plants are coming from and going. Unfortunately, I actually don't have a lot of information on their research that has been ongoing, but I believe they're looking to release a report soon on it. And I think due to it being a joint collaboration, as soon as they're done, they will be out with it soon. So unfortunately, I don't actually have much to share with everyone. We're also anticipating to see the outcomes of their research as well and the trials.
Thank you very much. I have one question before we get more questions.
Doctora, hay una más en el chat.
Okay. From Ivan. Thank you for your presentation. Do you have any examples of how the illegal plant trade has led to the spread of invasive species?
We have quite a few examples on our Sentinel network online on the BGCI. If needed, perhaps I can share my email address and I can point you directly to it. Unfortunately, from the top of my mind, I did not have any direct examples, but there have been a few instances where either pests have been taken across, and I believe in one instance where sort of the invasive species was causing a direct impact on the native species as well. So there's on our website, there's definitely a lot of examples that you can research through. Thank you.
Thank you, Laxmi. José Luis, ¿iba a hacer una pregunta?
Sí, doctora, si me permite. Gracias.
Please.
Thank you, Laxmi. Nice to meet you. And I got just one question, and I'm gonna read it because my English is bad. Maybe I missed that part of the information, but can you tell us about if you train public servants such as police, custom prosecutors to identify illegal plant trafficking? We are working actually in Mexico about training in these public servants, and I would like to hear how do you do?
So the training, I think, is very difficult, just because I've mentioned it's so in-depth, it's so scientific. Most people will spend their entire careers dedicating to one species, and with the training, we're looking to do it for so many, to be able to do that. I think with the training, the best way to do it is you have to really narrow down the focus to your most illegally traded species, and then kind of take it from there. At the same time, because we have to realize the enforcements are just starting on this. So we start at a very small level, but once their knowledge grows, you are then in this room to expand it even further to different species within that group. At the moment, if this is the thing, see, then you also need your baseline data of which species do you focus on. So again, this perhaps goes back to the type of plants that are being confiscated. So looking within that and knowing that this is the higher trade and these are the ones we want to be training more of the public on is how you would proceed. And very similar to how when you would start teaching students, for example, about certain plants, you would go with very simple characteristics before going to the finer details. Because if you can manage them to group a certain number of, for example, this type of orchids, even though there'll be a few others in there, you know that they're collecting more. But then as they become better at that, then you will narrow down to a single type of specific species. And then yeah, you have to cast it as, I think, very much as you would with students, go very broad and general from the groups and then narrow down again is the only sort of level of training we have reached at the moment within our discussions. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you. We have two more other questions and one comment from a specialist at the National University in Mexico. Do you still have time?
Yes, of course. No problem.
Okay. So we have a question from Liliana Flores, and she says, what is the relevance of the cultural customs or traditions of the countries with the largest trafficking markets?
So do you mean in terms of local customs or like, yeah?
Yeah, I believe so. How this influences the demand for certain taxonomic groups, I believe, yeah.
Yeah. So in general, if there is a local sort of tradition for certain plants, they will go through with it. For example, even in, let's say, South Africa, a certain group of community are looking at a specific plant. But in general, that community will be very good at making sure that the plant is surviving in the wild as well. Because although they are taking it for traditional use, they're also ensuring the population is there. The issue comes when the demand is not from the country and there is a level of monetization where certain communities are told, I will give you money to go pick this flower. In this instance, that's a transaction, and the communities are not looking after that population for traditional culture. They're actually just going to get it to sell. So with certain plants, for example, there are many different communities which have different sort of traditions specific to certain plants. And that, of course, is very much based on sort of local indigenous knowledge. And there's plenty of books out there. So I don't specifically have an example of a specific community with a specific species for you, unfortunately. But I hope that kind of helps answer your question. If I haven't, then please put it in the chat again. And I apologize if I haven't.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lakshmi. There is a comment from a specialist at the National University in Mexico that they are already collaborating in an illegal wood timber project where they are using mass spectrometry to identify timber species. But he has a question about this, and he says, or she, Ali, I don't know if it's a she or he, I'm sorry, but that they cannot be themselves who do the analysis of the samples. It has to be in Mexico. I mean, it's a particular case in Mexico. It has to be the authority, the governmental authorities who are in charge of doing this. So she or she, they are asking whether if you could talk a little bit more about how is the role of the botanic garden taking this type of actions to take the authority to do so.
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, most of the gardens are more recently becoming aware of the illegal plant trade. I know some of them work with timber as well, but they themselves are facing challenges for funding and capacity. And I think many of them are just starting to incorporate in their policy that they want to involve the government more. So I don't think they are in a position to push yet for more involvement from the government. They themselves are just starting to start incorporating a way to address the illegal plant and timber trade. What I can say in terms of like needing to do these assessments, again, I think it's always an issue of funding. So I think there are many more sort of funders available now regarding illegal timber, for example, of our project as well. Another resource perhaps would be to address CITES or the Red List, who are working specifically with threatened species, who may be able to provide a bit more understanding on this. And for example, with CITES, they have an office for each country. They will have a member of person of government, perhaps, who deals directly with the CITES national plans, who may be better approached rather than gardens regarding this situation and sort of the analysis of the trees that you've got. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. We have one more. Can you do
No
that?
problem. No
It's a
problem.
general one. I mean, Elizabeth is asking, we already know that it's the cicadas, the cicads, the orchids, the cacti, timber, precious species that are most of the trafficked plants worldwide. She's asking what are the most trafficked plant species worldwide and what factors contribute to their high demand. We already know that these are the main taxonomy groups involved, but I don't know if you can add something if you want to.
Sure. I think the groups I have mentioned are the highest in demand. They are the most threatened. And thank you for listing them again, Ines. But I think in terms of the demand, sometimes it is almost like fashion. At the moment in Asia, for instance, there's a very high demand by those who can afford it to have giant furnitures made of rosewood, for instance. And if that kind of fashion trend comes in, then again, there's a demand. It's very similar to like the illegal animal and animal parts trade. If, for instance, there's a demand for certain furs and it goes viral and everyone who's got the money wants it, then that demand goes up. On a lower scale with plants, it's also, if you look at TikTok, there's a hashtag TikTok houseplant or something that has got over 1 billion sort of subscribers. So if one of those influencers just says, look at this psycad, I got it. There's an immediate rush for more psychads to be bought. So, there's also the issue of sort of plant influences are a very big situation that can influence the demand as well. And often they are also unaware of what is rare, what is threatened, and what is being illegally taken in the wild as well. So those would be the factors that probably impact some of the groups that I mentioned as well. I
Thank
hope
you,
that helps.
Leslie.
No problem.
You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation the Flora Guard report. Is this public?
Yes. Yes, this is public on the Q website. If I can find it later, I'll email it to you and you can perhaps share with those who have attended as well.
That would be great. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. And can I just my question before we say
Yes, of
goodbye?
course, please.
Because you mentioned in different occasions the launch of the initiative during the IUCN World Congress in October. So I was wondering if this launch will be during the forum of the Congress, so I can look for it. And
Yeah, sure. I believe we have a few different areas we're presenting the talks. So I think we will be at the forum as well. And we will also be with, for example, the Red List platform and a few others. So we will come with a team and we will be across many of those areas. And I think if possible, we were looking into also having a way to showcase this online as a hybrid situation. So you don't have to be there in person. We're just still working on the details of that with the team. But if that does happen, of course, I will happily share those details with you and for everyone else as well.
yeah, I submitted a proposal of offering a workshop on green criminology. If it's accepted, would you be able to help us for a few minutes, maybe sharing these study cases? Thank you.
Of course, happily.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know if somebody else, si alguien más tiene alguna otra pregunta, algún comentario. No, creo que ya no hay más preguntas en el chat. One of my students this week mentioned in the classroom that there is a whole genus of group of species, endemic species in Mexico, from Pachyphytum. Are you familiar with this group of species? Not in particular, because they haven't been evaluated in the red list in Mexico. But I don't know if you know if they have been assessed using the red list methodology, the IUCN red list.
Unfortunately, I don't have this information specifically. As I mentioned, each team has their own species that they deal with. But if you can email this question, I can easily ask the team in BGCI and get back to you. No problem at all.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Well, thank you very much, Laxmi, for accepting our invitation and being with everybody here today in this seminar. If there is no more comments or questions, José Luis, Ignacio, we can, on behalf of all the coordinators of the seminar, we want to thank you. And we will send your certificate of participation later on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. And I hope to hear from all the listeners and from the coordinators as well. So thank you.
Thank you. And I hope to meet sometime somewhere in the near future.
I hope so.
Work something together, and with all the specialists here in Latin America, I'm sure there will be people in the audience willing to talk with you further or work something.
That would be amazing. I'll just put my email address in because I know it went really fast.
Could share your email before leaving.
Yeah, definitely.
That would be great. And I don't know if okay, I don't know if José Luis and Ignacio want
Thank you so much.
a seguir hablando en inglés con ustedes. ¿Quieren compartir, antes de irnos, de qué va la sesión del seminario para la próxima semana? Para compartir eso. Porque Lasmi es la última ponente del día de hoy, entonces antes de despedirnos, poder compartir.
Doctora.
Sí.
El siguiente módulo, si no me equivoco, doctor Ignacio, me corriges, se denomina herramientas tecnológicas y están está enfocado en precisamente cómo se han ido implementando y desarrollando pues diversas herramientas en términos de ampliar los conocimientos que se generan sobre algunas problemáticas en temas ambientales y en particular conflictos y crímenes. Entonces vamos a tener a 3 participantes en la primera sesión, en la del día 4, y vamos a tener otros participantes el día 6 respecto a técnicas cartográficas y análisis geoespacial. Vamos a tener veterinaria forense y participaciones transdisciplinarias. Este módulo de herramientas tecnológicas incluye temáticas relacionadas a la victimología forense, al uso de datos y herramientas para detectar y combatir delitos ambientales. Y pues básicamente es eso. Vamos a tener ponentes de primer nivel, entonces pues esperemos contar con la asistencia de todas y todos. Y pues un día antes les haremos llegar la liga de ingreso.
¿Son ponentes de México todos? ¿En español será la sesión?
En español será la sesión, sí. Toda la sesión va a ser en español. Vamos a tener sí, todos van a ser en español, doctor. Sí. Sobre todo porque vamos a recuperar una ponencia que se había tenido que posponer de un módulo anterior. Entonces vamos a incorporarlo aquí, que es el del maestro Camarena, y vamos a tener la participación del biólogo Fernando Catalán, de la doctora Teresa Ambrosio, de la médico Claudia Edwards, de la también médico Jimena Ailín Bori Martínez, del doctor Gilberto Ballesteros Rodea, de la maestra Socorro Flores y pues, del maestro Camarero. Y va a ser igual, en el mismo horario, todo normal, a la misma hora y por el mismo canal.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, pues si no tenemos algo más que agregar para el día de hoy, nos vemos la siguiente semana y agradezco muchísimo pues que nos hayan acompañado hoy. Y con esto de que fue en inglés, pues se vuelve un poco más complicado, pero las ponentes fueron excelentes y espero que lo hayan disfrutado y aprovechado. Y cualquier comentario o interés de contactarlas, pues nos pueden escribir y nosotros podemos generar ese enlace con ellas. Y pues gracias a los que nos acompañaron de otros países también, de Latinoamérica, de España, sabemos que hay gente de otras latitudes por acá. Les agradecemos mucho, gracias José Luis y gracias Ignacio y gracias a Rosana y a José Manuel también de docencia del CRIM por el apoyo. Nos vemos el próximo martes.
Muchas gracias, cuídense mucho, excelente día, nos vemos el martes. Saludos. Gracias,
Muchas
Iván,
gracias.
gracias, Raúl, gracias, Mari, gracias.